broadly around sort of local government in Scotland in various aspects. And I'm grateful for this, excuse me, for this opportunity to talk about some of that work and to really this morning, of course, this afternoon in Scotland, which still confuses me, but really just to sort of provide a broad brush overview of the historical development of local government in Scotland, particularly since the 19th century, and to kind of look at some of the patterns and challenges that have recurred in the last 200 years up to the present day. And someone there was just kind of pointing out that this still remains a really challenging and in some ways quite controversial time for local government in Scotland, as this is a week that most, if not all, local councils in Scotland set their budgets, and they've all, I think, certainly most of them, probably all of them, have raised local taxes while probably cutting services at the same time. So we can maybe talk about that in the discussion. The background here was actually prompted, the background in the title slide was prompted, I think I remember telling Connie a couple of weeks ago, was prompted by, of all things, by PowerPoint. But the other slides, I have chosen the images myself, I hasten to add, but I just thought that was quite a nice background, so I kept it. Um, so, the for some reason, one of my screens is showing the intro slide, and the other one is still showing the. Sorry, just bear with me
We're
a second.
looking at the very first slide. Now we see
Yeah,
the introduction.
has it moved now, Connie? I think it should now say introduction.
It
And
does. It does.
that's
We can
great.
see it.
Sorry,
Yes.
that was odd. I've never had that problem before. It's probably something to do with my setup here. Yeah, so as I say, this is very much a broad brush whistle stop tour, and I'm really sorry, Connie, but I think I said to you I was aiming at 10 slides. I've ended up with 27, but some of them are basically photos and things like that. So I'll
The
try.
more the merrier.
Okay, so what I want to do first of all is to just kind of give a broad overview of the overview. So we're going to look at some of the origins and kind of ancient antecedents of Scottish local government. But as I say, we're going to focus mainly on the 19th and 20th centuries with some sort of discussion of developments in the present 21st century. Um, so we look basically around about the time of the Great Reform Act, 1832. Although I think that was for the UK, 1833 in Scotland, always mix that up. But between 1832 and 1929, Scotland's local, basically present day or framework broadly of local government emerged. And we're going to look at how that occurred, and we're going to look at a couple of case studies of communities around Glasgow, which took advantage of the sort of legislative framework that enabled this, and we're going to look at some of the pros and cons of that legislative framework. Basically, the General Police Act, which created a series of, if you like, local police states, although they weren't particularly, Orwellian or anything like that. Although which is not to say they were perfect, but we'll get to that. In the 20th century, you start to get, and of course, I'm glossing over loads here for now, but in the 20th century, you start to get increasing kind of territorial and structural consolidation and kind of much more top-down forms of local government in Scotland, particularly towards the end of the century when you get the present day unitary councils emerge with sort of 32 unitary councils where all services are housed under one roof, sorry, but they are quite remote, both conceptually and often literally. If you look at areas like the Highlands, literally remote from the communities they serve. So we'll look at some of the issues around that. Um, in response to some of those challenges, in the last sort of 10 years, there's a policy being promoted, although it's not a particularly new policy, but it's been formalised and legislated for under the SNP, Scottish Government, as community empowerment. And we'll kind of look at a little bit of that. And then we'll kind of try and tie it together with some conclusions and maybe go a little bit beyond the classic role of the historian and suggest some possible alternative models for local government. Although I should say, don't get too excited because about 10 years ago, a number of colleagues suggested other ways of doing local government, and it hasn't really happened that way, mainly because of funding cuts, but also because it's not entirely clear that policymakers listen to historians, or perhaps I'm just being cynical, but we'll see. Um, but yeah, so that's kind of the overview of what we're going to go through in this presentation. The first sort of slide I've got here with an image on it is basically showing present day Rutherglen Town Hall, and that kind of encapsulates some of the complicated legacy of local government in Scotland, because you've got a 16th century toll booth, which is kind of bolted on effectively to a 19th century town hall. Rutherglen, some of you may know, has always been out with the boundaries of Glasgow, although that has been sort of contested now and again, and Glasgow has often, I think, even fairly recently, Michael Shanks MP, if I remember right, suggested that it should be part of the city. But Rutherglen and Govan, which we'll talk about shortly as well, have claims to existing before Glasgow itself, at least in terms of things like royal charters and church favour and things like that. So there's this kind of it's a good kind of visual metaphor for how kind of complicated and sometimes messy local government in Scotland is and can be. So I'm going to move on and look at where the system we've got today came from. And if you don't mind, I'll just take a quick sip of water. So, which of course is a municipal benefit as well, which we'll talk about as well. But before 1832, so before basically the right to vote in parliamentary elections began to extend in the UK, including Scotland, although there was a different act for Scotland, as I say, I think I always forget which one came first, but one was 1832, the other was 1833. And of course, this was a Whig landslide general election victory on both sides of the border. And that had implications for local government because the sort of idea of local self-government began to be promoted. And that was an idea that really took root in the 19th century and had, like most things in history, had a kind of good side and a darker side, which again we'll look at some examples of that as we progress. But before 1832, local government, basically in Scotland, we had boroughs and counties, and the the boroughs were for urban areas and the counties were for rural areas. Of course, complicating things, boroughs often, in fact, always sat in counties, and that was something that caused some administrative confusion in the 19th century and even beyond. But again, I'll give some examples of that as we go on. It's worth noting, though, that although local government in Scotland especially is often seen as unglamorous and subordinate to whether the UK Parliament in Victorian times or more recently the Scottish Parliament, it's worth noting that in the original Scottish Parliament, the borough commissioners, so representatives of the boroughs, effectively councillors, we'd call them today, represented one of the three estates in that parliament. I have to say the original Scottish Parliament is not my expertise, but I'm taking that from the Scottish Parliament, the present day devolved Scottish Parliament's website's sort of history section. So if you want to know more about that, you can look there. And of course, I know there's a lot of scholarship on it as well. Um, County government, it's worth noting as well, was conducted before 1832 and even afterwards fairly remotely by commissioners of supply and justices of the peace. Justices of the peace, JPs, existed in England as well, still do. Um, and they were kind of the most local face of government in communities, but they were still quite remote. Urban boroughs were in sort of two main categories originally. You had royal boroughs, which had basically been created by the crown, and you had boroughs of barony and regality, whose authority basically derived from aristocratic patronage. According to R.M. Urquhart, who I'll reference a lot here, um, Scottish justices of the peace had less influence and prestige in reality than their English counterparts, despite on paper holding the same powers. Later on in the early 20th century, Fabian activist and scholar Mabel Atkinson, who wrote one of the first sort of textbooks on Scottish local government, noted that most pre-1832, most pre-Reform Act county inhabitants in Scotland had really no voice in local government. And that was so even as the parliamentary franchise gradually became more inclusive. Of course, as many of you will appreciate, women didn't even get the vote in the UK till 1918, and it wasn't the same terms as men till 1929. Working class men really only got the vote, I suppose you could argue 1918, but certainly no earlier than the 1880s. So there was a kind of fits and starts, sort of expansion of the parliamentary franchise and often local government reform, or at least debates about local government reform tied in with that. For example, you had the first female provost in Scotland, so sort of the equivalent of mayor, was, if I remember rightly, elected in 1907 for Dollar. My old supervisor, Irene Maver, would be annoyed if I get the date wrong, so I hope I've not got it wrong. But basically, my point is that you had women elected to local government and actually holding senior roles in local government before women could even be elected to Parliament legally. So there's clearly something to be said about the pioneering nature of local government, for all that it's not necessarily seen as a most glamorous set of institutions in Scotland. Um, yeah, so that's sort of the other thing to kind of note here is that local government is fundamental to sort of civilized modern life. For example, water on tap, sanitation, bin collections, um, even street lighting and paving, things like that are provided, or at least historically were provided by local government. I'm sure they still are in in Scotland as well. But they were really the reason that communities that, which we'll talk about some examples shortly, communities, areas that didn't have local government either had to invent it for themselves or to kind of contribute and basically fund for themselves privately these kind of public goods. So you begin to see this pattern of the Westminster state, if you like, beginning to at least empower or enable local communities across the UK, particularly in Scotland, to do something about their own local conditions, especially as you got industrialization and urbanization, creating massive population growth and real infrastructure challenges, and of course public health challenges in certain areas. So more on that to follow. Um, but the other side of this, and we'll talk more about what the legislative framework looked like shortly, but the other side of that was that Atkin, who of course was writing later on, and she's part of the kind of transatlantic, as well as being a Fabian, she's kind of allied with the transatlantic progressive movement. And she thought it was a bit problematic that all of the villages in 19th century Scotland, in her words, wanted to be made into boroughs, with the right to provide watching, lighting, paving, sanitation, clean water, public health for themselves. Now, you might think that's a bit odd. Why is she annoyed that places want these things? But it's not so much about the kind of services themselves as how they're organised. And she wants that done on more efficient, rational grounds than potentially every small village having its own full police force and things like that. So we'll kind of talk a bit about some of how that played out around Glasgow shortly. But it's worth noting that even before there was a general police framework, a sort of general enabling law to create local government in Scotland that could be accessed by all communities, you started to get a number of communities, not least towns and cities, basically petitioning for individual bespoke acts of parliament to kind of set things up for themselves. But that was an extremely expensive and time-consuming business. And again, it reflected the fact that industrialisation and urbanisation were happening in Scotland, but they were happening at varying speeds and intensities in different areas. Now, I've used a term general police, and I have mentioned literal police forces for each town and village, But it's worth noting as well that the idea of general police was much wider than that. And it came from the sort of classical world, from ancient Greek politeia or the Latin politia. And although it did include what we would think of today as police, it encompassed a lot more besides that. And of course, even into the 20th century, the role of local government expanded and the local citizens' expectations of the state expanded as well. Of course, in the early 20th century, there was a expectation increasingly that council should provide housing. And of course, that escalated, particularly after World War II, that because of the Blitz, for example. As I say, I'm sort of based myself near Clydebank, which was heavily affected by the German bombing campaign, and that's a good example, if that's not a too tactless way of putting it, but certainly an example of somewhere that needed to be literally rebuilt after the war, and local government played a really big role in that. Um, so yeah, so that's sort of a broad indication of how things developed. What was then this General Police Act, and what were these police boroughs that it created? Well, Police Act basically created and empowered local authorities, so new, usually boroughs, but not necessarily boroughs. For example, you could have an existing borough or village could effectively almost like download powers from the Act, but not all of them. So they could pick it, they could sort of cherry pick, if you like, what they felt they needed at any given time. There was a kind of complicated process by which they could do that. So they had to raise a petition. I forget the threshold for the petition, but they had to do a petition to the local sheriff, who would then sort of sign off on whether or not the community could access the Act and become a borough, or at least use some of the powers of a borough. Um, Police Acts, as I think I've kind of touched on, but they basically allowed local authorities to address things like crime and punishment, water supplies, paving, lighting, maintaining streets and sewers, drainage, cleansing, nuisance control, and general public health. They created roles like Inspector of Nuisances, which I don't know why, but the title just amuses me. I think it's because as a child, you're often told you're a nuisance if you're naughty, things like that. But yeah, so communities could access that. But what was a community? This is where it gets a bit tricky, because as we'll see in a bit, Glasgow was a community. So did the boroughs surrounding it claim to be communities, and you got a literal argument over what a community actually was, where its boundaries should lie, and how it should be defined. And Glasgow began to advocate the idea of communities of interest, whereas the surrounding boroughs would argue that it was more important to be what they would see as compact and flourishing and things like that. There were other arguments going on because, of course, as you get the expansion of the parliamentary franchise, the right to vote, you also get the growth of the Labour Party. And they're calling out things like regressive taxation regimes in places like Govan and Partick that were separate boroughs from Glasgow, but which were basically effectively overtaxing their working people. So Glasgow, by contrast, had half rates for poorer households, whereas the surrounding boroughs to Glasgow did not really do that. There was also like Glasgow basically provided more for all of its citizens, partly because of the scale of it. But it found that communities outside it could kind of almost become sort of local tax havens and avoid some of the responsibility of paying for municipal goods while still benefiting from them. So, for example, the Glasgow Town Council used to get quite annoyed, or at least some of the local newspapers get quite annoyed, that West End Park, present day Kelvin Grove Park, in the West End of Glasgow, was used by people from Partick who did not pay the taxes to kind of maintain the park, things like that. Um, but yeah, so communities around Glasgow and its surrounding police boroughs, basically over about 60 years between 1850 and 1912, police boroughs were set up around Glasgow, which back then was much smaller. In fact, I've got this on one of the later slides. So I'll just quick, here we go. So you can sort of see there that you have the city growing its boundaries literally between 1800 and 1938. And there's different sort of acreages that come in. But if you look towards the left of your screen, you can see Partick and sort of Govan. Uh, and they were the most populous parts of Glasgow. In fact, they counted by the time they were incorporated into the city, they were among the 10 most populous urban communities in Scotland, including Glasgow itself and Edinburgh. So the acreage alone doesn't really do justice to their strategic importance for the city. But as I say, we'll get to some of that later. But if I just go back to where were we? So back to the general police framework. So yeah, 1831 basically saw the Convention of Royal Boroughs, which was the kind of representative body for Scottish local government institutions, press unanimously for a general police act, which would allow all communities in Scotland to obtain the powers they needed rather than having to petition for individual acts of parliament. Um, the examples of that included Glasgow, Edinburgh, Paisley, Kilmarnock, and Leith. 1831, the kind of predecessor or precursor to what's now called COSLA, the Confederation of Scottish Local Authorities. Back in 1831, this was the Convention of Royal Boroughs and represented Scottish local government institutions to basically to Parliament and other bodies. And it pressed unanimously for this idea of a general police act, which would allow all communities to obtain the powers they required. And again, that embodied this liberal notion, liberal party, but with a small L as well, in the sense of it was liberal associated with ideology. But the liberal notion of local self-government, whereby local inhabitants were empowered to identify their own priorities and to raise funding for them through their own locally elected representatives. And the principle was embodied in the Borough Police Scotland Act of 1833 and, of course, in later acts all the way up to 1891. There we've got on this slide uh, an early postcard of Partick Borough Hall, which is towards the right of the image. You can see some tenements, tenement flats, houses to housing towards the left of it. And this is kind of your sort of almost stereotypical image of a Scottish high street, albeit you can't see shops and pubs on it. They tended to be round the corner and down the road when it came to Partick. But this kind of gives you an idea of the sorts of physical buildings that were created under the new acts. So the sort of, as J.F. McCaffrey put it, I think it's on a later slide, there's this sort of the modern image of Scottish towns actually was created mostly through the Police Borough Acts. And this system was pioneering for the UK. It was ahead of England, although over time it was reformed and England began to catch up and in some ways overtake what could be provided in Scotland. And so there was a little bit of a competition going on, as you might expect, between the two countries within the UK. And the General Police Act, which was basically passed in the 1830s, was a pioneering one in the UK context for the range of issues that it allowed local governments to tackle and for the flexibility and relative autonomy it offered relative to England. However, it did have its flaws. And in practice, if not in principle, there were a number of problems with it. One was that the local franchise was restricted. So initially, you basically, if your property's rental was worth more than £10, then you paid local franchise and you therefore got a vote. If your property was not above that threshold, then you were shut out and didn't really have a say. And you literally didn't have a vote. So that was a real problem. in terms of the democratic ideal that's associated with liberal local self-government. The new boroughs as well had limited tax and spend powers. Now, in some ways, that's something that's never really gone away with local government in Scotland, but we'll get to that later. But local government is seen very much as subordinate to the national government, and therefore its powers and responsibilities are quite heavily circumscribed. And even larger towns and cities, including Glasgow and Edinburgh, initially struggled to fund major water, sewer, and drainage schemes. There was also a lack of enforcement. Basically, people didn't want to pay their local tax or didn't want to cooperate with, a kind of early planning sort of requirements and so on, then there was very little that local government could do about it. Although gradually that changed over time and more powers were kind of asked for and legislated for. But improvements also there's a reason for it. So if you go back to take an example of Partick. So Partick became a police borough in 1852. It had experienced rapid population growth allied to the shipbuilding industry and therefore industrialisation and urbanisation in the early 19th century. And therefore, what was originally a small village became rapidly built around. There was no sewers or adequate drainage or even fresh water. So you began to get the formation of effectively a cesspit in the low-lying parts of the original village. That led to disease, and a local guy, in fact, it was James Greenhorn, who basically had been scientifically trained and was able to make the case in the 1840s that look, this is there is, public health is not just for rich people, and if poorer original villagers are becoming ill, that disease will spread. So there was this kind of idea of, if you like, enlightened self-interest that began to motivate demands for basically adopting the General Police Act in order to do something about these problems. However, in the interim, there was really what passed for local government was based on middle class voluntarism. So there would be effectively a whip round for some, night watchmen, for some lamps, things like that. But it really wasn't in any kind of systematic footing. And there was a lot of resentment from those who did pay against those who chose not to because it was entirely voluntary. And that there was this idea even after the General Police Acts were adopted by these communities, it tended to be that most of the sort of improvements and infrastructure tended to go to the areas that least needed it. So that was again a factor of that limited franchise and the fact that you had to have more expensive property in order to qualify for the vote or to stand for office. New towns as well, like Johnston and Galston, were not covered by the original General Police Act. Restrictions as well. This is where Scottish local government was and to some extent remains messy. You still had the counties. I think I mentioned earlier that the boroughs sat within counties, and you still had restrictions around county lines and the role of the local sheriff in approving new police boroughs, and that led to anomalies like Kinning Park on the south side of Glasgow becoming a police borough in 1871, even when it would have been really obvious just looking at it on a map without taking account of the county lines that it would have was fairly small and would have been much more rationally joined either to Glasgow or to Govan. But because of the county lines and the precedents around that, it had to become its own borough. Um, Graham Morton, who I know you've had on the forum before, his early work was on sort of Scottish civic nationalism, and he has written about the complexity and decentralised nature of mid-Victorian Scottish local government. So again, it was really messy and complicated, and that's something that didn't really go away into the early 20th century, as Alan McConnell later noted in an early 2000s textbook on local government in Scotland. Um, Apologies, there's a typo on that slide. Um, it's worth as well just reinforcing that local autonomy under the General Police Acts in Scotland was never absolute. It was highly conditional and circumscribed. Sovereignty then, as now within the UK, was vested at Westminster. Even the Scottish Parliament is not sovereign because Scotland's not an independent country. There's also within the UK no entrenchment to local tiers of government or lower tiers of government. That's to say, it's not a federal system, and therefore, in theory and often in practice, if you go back to the 1980s, local government can be legislated out of existence, effectively at the stroke of a Westminster or in the present day a Holyrood pen. That also could even apply to the Scottish Parliament, although that would seem unlikely to happen. Um, there was, however, a pre-World War One convention, not a rule, but a kind of accepted way of doing things. There's an awful lot of conventions in the UK political system and UK constitution, so to speak. But there was this convention that Parliament would not mess with a local authority unless the local ratepayers consented to that. And that was seen as an obstacle to Glasgow's attempt to expand and consolidate its municipal territory, which was, although the boroughs surrounding Glasgow kind of tended to present that as just Glasgow being greedy and aggressive was one of the words they used. Um, the other side of that was that the city had claims that it had a more fair and, a more sort of comprehensive offer to its ratepayers and indeed non-ratepayers and to residents. So there was a lot to consider there as well. Now, the General Police Act, again, they did allow county sheriffs to be petitioned for police borough status, and the decision, however, lay ultimately with the sheriff and was subject to county lines. The new, come back to the sheriffs in a minute because there's a good example of that in Govan again, but the new police boroughs exercised only delegated authority, which was subject to tight legislative constraints. Now, you could argue that that's still true of local government in Scotland, again, because sovereignty is located in the national, which is the UK Parliament, not even the Scottish Parliament. Although, of course, local government, just to complicate things, is a devolved matter in Scotland. So there is that. But yeah, so for example, around about 1905 in Govan, which was at the same time as resisting through a political legal campaign, being amalgamated with Glasgow, or as it would have put it, annexed to Glasgow, there was an opportunity arose whereby Lint House, which was to the west of Govan on the south side of the Clyde, was a kind of a growing kind of inhabited area, which was not part of any government set up except for the county government of Lanarkshire. And that wasn't really quite good enough. And this was seen as a really respectable and quite prestigious area. And basically, there was a local sort of referendum in Linthouse as to whether it wanted to join, whether its potential ratepayers wanted to join Govan or whether they wanted to join Glasgow. And I can't even remember the figures, but basically it was an inconclusive referendum, and therefore the sheriff ruled based on precedent and county lines that Govan should, more or less on technical grounds, should claim the area. And without a shred of self-awareness or irony, the local Govan press basically promoted our annexed territory, and things like that. So, of course, it was only 7 years before, of course, the city did take Govan, and a big part of why that happened was that the new so-called annexed territory included the Shield Hall cooperative works. So there was a kind of quite a quite a potentially Labour stroke socialist leaning electorate that they'd just taken over and welcomed into their sort of bosom, and it was almost like a kind of Trojan horse. Um, so yeah, until 1900 as well, police boroughs were not entitled to use coats of arms and traditional Scottish civic titles like provost, baillie, which is kind of like a senior magistrate, and councillor. Instead, they were legally chief magistrates of police, junior magistrates of police, commissioner of police, and so on. However, the new boroughs just ignored that and, pretty much created coats of arms and called themselves the same titles. Um, Borough halls and offices, which they built as well. I showed you an example from Party. I'll show you Governs in a wee while. But they basically helped, as Irene Maver has pointed out, to convey gravitas and authority. The local press, which is really not to be overlooked, in the creation of sort of civic Scotland, it basically created what Benedict Anderson would have called imagined communities, except imagined local communities. For example, the Govan Press referred often to the ancient and famous borough of Govan. Now, Govan was an ancient community, genuinely. It goes all the way back to at least the Viking era. However, the borough of Govan, the police borough of Govan, was a modern creation and a product really of industrialisation. So there was a sense in which they were doing a little bit of the kind of thing that I don't know if you remember when Margot MacDonald, no, it wasn't Margot MacDonald, sorry, when Winnie Ewing gave the opening speaker when the Scottish Parliament was the present day Scottish Parliament was set up in 1999, and she referred to it being hereby reconvened from the original Scottish Parliament, and of course, technically, and often literally as well, as I think Katrina MacDonald's written, there were different institutions. So there's that, but there's that thing that quite often political leaders do, where they try to link what they're doing now with and modern exigencies with an ancient historic past to kind of borrow legitimacy from the past. I mean, it's not to say I'm unsympathetic to what Winnie Ewing was doing there. It was a nice touch, but there is still something interesting about that kind of almost like borrowing legitimacy from the past. Um, but yeah, so Govan was a good example of that as well. Hobsbawm wrote about invented tradition, and more recently as well, Cohen wrote about, not Leonard Cohen, but Anthony Cohen, wrote about the symbolic construction of community, and these were all about kind of rhetorical devices and often using things like architecture and symbolism to kind of create a sense that for example, police boroughs were somehow ancient. And part of that was because these communities felt on the defensive against Glasgow. So if they could prove that they were older than Glasgow and that they had more right to be there, then that would kind of make it more difficult for Glasgow to take them in. That sort of idea. Um, this brings us as well to I mentioned Govan being a genuinely ancient community. That's a photo showing Govan Old and its churchyard. And there's been a church and a place of worship, if you go further back on that site, at least since the 6th century. In the late, some of you might already have seen this, but if you go on YouTube, you can find Time Team, the the sort of famous UK, at least within the UK, famous architecture show where, not architecture, sorry, archaeology show where they basically did a dig in Govan, and it was really interesting. Of course, more recently as well, the Scottish Archaeological Survey has been there, and that's Dalgleish and Driscoll reference there from 2009. So there is a really important community, and the police borough was important as well. However, there was a little bit of a sense of sleight of hand with claiming that something that was founded in 1864 to refer to that by 20 years later as ancient is a little bit cheeky. Um, okay, and there's of course some of the architecture literally of industrial and police borough govern, which is still there, but of course it's now used for, I think Franz Ferdinand recorded one of their albums in 2009 in Govan Town Hall, sorry, Govan Borough Hall. So nevertheless, you can see what they're trying to do there, that you've got boroughs that are created for modern conditions in the 19th century and are really trying to borrow this sense of a rich ancient past. Um, the Lindsay Acts basically were a kind of an improvement and enhancement of the police borough framework. Leith Borough's provost and a wealthy shipwright in his own, I was going to say in his own right, that sounds like a pun, but Leith Borough's provost from 1860 to 1866, William Lindsay, promoted an extensively revised and updated General Police Act, uh, which was largely reciprocally influenced by recent English local government reforms, embodying a mechanism for basically the police boroughs, once they're set up, being able to take on more powers without pursuing an individual act every time. So again, it's about trying to streamline things, trying to allow more flexibility. And under that act, 185 towns, including 84 entirely new boroughs, improved their local conditions. And according to J.F. McCaffrey, towards the end of the 20th century, that effectively, as I say, created Scotland's typical Victorian urban landscape of baronial town halls and regular paved streets with tenements and pubs. Some of the boroughs created or improved under that act included Kingussie in Inverness with 700 souls at incorporation, and Clydebank, Dumbartonshire at 10,000 when it was founded. So again, if you think about the variation in populations that are covered that can become boroughs, again, you can see why there's this later on progressive argument and socialist argument, not that the two are the same thing, but there is this idea that, well, there are gaps and anomalies and there's inconsistencies and there's patchwork, and that's not necessarily a good thing. The Lindsay Act, though, in its flexibility, so this was like the kind of mid 1800s Police Act. I've got the dates somewhere, but it's not on this slide. But its flexibility meant that significant variations were identifiable in the pattern of local administrations and powers across Scotland. Again, including Govan, which neighboured Glasgow, and Partick, which was just across the river from Govan. They're now joined by a footbridge. Partick adopted the General Police Act in 1852, and it became a borough itself, despite again being contiguous to the city. And another anomaly was in Dumfries and Maxwelltown, which was an example of a police borough that overlapped with an ancient one, because Dumfries was a 12th century royal borough, and Maxwelltown was an 1810 created borough of barony. Mabel Atkinson again identified serious gaps and anomalies, and therefore inefficiency, by the turn of the 20th century, and argued that while inhabitants' wishes about whether or not they should have a borough or not of their own ought to be most seriously considered, they should not be the sole determining factor in creating or maintaining a borough. And in many ways, that anticipated what remains an unsolved problem of where exactly the balance between local autonomy and consistent service delivery compatible with human rights should lie. Towards the end of the 20th century, you started to get this idea again of communities of interest taking over, and municipal socialism as well kind of intermingled with that, leading to the consolidation, for example, of Glasgow. So the oldest and largest of the police boroughs surrounding Glasgow were Partick and Govan. Again, they were two of only 9 Scottish urban communities, including Glasgow and Edinburgh, with populations above 50,000 at that time. And their leaders had been really good at rhetorically and legally challenging Glasgow's right to absorb them. At one point, they even got John Stuart Mill to basically, without looking into the detail, he was able to say, oh, in principle, these communities, if they want to be independent, they should be. So there was that sort of thing going on. The case for absorption was in many ways complex, involving counterclaims about things like the parliamentary franchise, as this was reformed in different phases. And however, it frequently came down to arguments over which setup would be more efficient and centralised, or whether local independence, as they put it, was better. And Govan, Partick, and the other boroughs around Glasgow argued they were more compact and tax efficient than what they saw as an over-centralised and overweening city. And to make things even weirder, gender came into it as well. So Glasgow was referred in the 1870s by the Govan Press as Granny Glasgow, and the boroughs were manly and were inhabited by, I'll tell you more about the context for this in a minute, but men of good character and physique. And the context for that was the international Fenian panics, which they were a thing, you know, they were feared in Canada and I think in the United States. Sean O'Cahoyne's written a lot about it. But in Govan, there was this sense, although communities all over North America and the UK did kind of engage in what you'd call almost like civil contingencies to stand up and resist the Fenians, there was something really pointed about the way in which Govan commissioned a force of special sort of voluntary constables, and there was a definite element of competition with Glasgow, and this happened round about the same time as one of the first sort of boundary disputes between Glasgow and Govan. Um, there's also a kind of sectarian thing there, but I won't get into that just now. The city argued for equalisation, back to the broad brush stuff, but the city argued for equalisation of obligations and amenities over large contiguous areas, and therefore what it called community of interest over more local claims to autonomy and uh, more local claims to autonomy and ancient community continuity. I gave you the examples of Govan and Rutherglen earlier on. Partick as well called itself the Balmoral of the Kings of Strathclyde. So again, you've got this kind of harking back to ancient times. Um, Territorial consolidation did happen in fits and starts. So Glasgow was surrounded in the sort of late 19th century by 9 police boroughs, and by 1912 it was surrounded by none. And interestingly, Govan and Partick held out the longest, despite being pretty much the first boroughs to be created outside the city. And they got a really important concession from the city, which has never really been implemented. And that was the idea of divisional management, which is something exactly how it would work, I don't think was ever spelled out, but it's something equivalent roughly to like New York's borough presidents or the the sort of, you know, I think remember there's a sort of, you could argue that although they're much smaller population wise, but Govan and Partick are kind of like the Brooklyn and Queens of Glasgow, both in the sense of being connected by a bridge and in terms of their kind of location within an expanded municipality. Um, so there's things like that to consider. Um, Centralisation within what became known as Greater Glasgow, greater in the sense of bigger, but potentially also sort of, it sounds almost Trumpian, doesn't it, when you look at it like that? But it was this idea that Glasgow would do more for its citizens if it was bigger. So it wasn't just about territory. Um, and one of the quotes that the quite early on in the annexation debates, William Collins, an ex-Glasgow Lord Provost, he made was that centralisation has its drawbacks as well as its advantages, and one of the drawbacks is the difficulty of maintaining over an extended area the thorough supervision that's necessary to secure economical management. So you got, you know, different factions within the boroughs and within the city. Some wanted annexation, some didn't, but over time it was annexation or stroke amalgamation that happened, or territorial consolidation. The other side of that argument was all that is involved in the extension of the city boundaries is the equalisation of privileges and obligations, and again, the establishment of community of interest. They were pointing out, I won't read all these out, but they were pointing out about how people outside the city could set up a police borough to avoid paying higher taxes relative to their property. And Glasgow's finally did absorb all the boroughs in 1912, but that did not immediately create any kind of socialist or progressive utopia. Hugh Lyon, one of the Labour Party figures at that time, compared the new expanded municipality to a private members club. And by the time Glasgow did gain a Labour provost, the municipal structures in Scotland had been overhauled in the 1920s. Really quickly, the police boroughs, particularly Govan and Partick, were marked internally by franchise restrictions. Part of that was because of the law for the UK as a whole, for certainly for Scotland as a whole, but also gerrymandering of ward boundaries to corral the working class electors into one ward so that they could never dominate the borough council. Um, There were, though, internal attempts at reforming that. And from the mid 19th century, ward committees were set up to scrutinise councillors' decisions, particularly ahead of elections. There was a case that even the existence of some boroughs could be seen as a conspiracy against working class residents, furthering their exploitation through slum conditions, limited services, and again, corralled ward representation. I mentioned already Linthouse, so I won't get bogged down in that. A few cartoons to highlight here. So there you've got 190, I think that's 1908, and the Govan Press is showing socialism being ostensibly rejected in Govan, although again the ward boundaries mean that that's not entirely a fair representation of the election. And then once you get to 1911, which is on the eve of annexation, you have the Govan Press. I think the cartoon's by TCF Brocci, who also held a really important role of basically editor of the Glasgow Evening Times, and then he kind of founded, I think, Kelvin Grove Museum for Glasgow Corporation. But he this cartoon here, you can tell that he favours the boroughs, and you've got the copy's not very clear, but you can see in the top annexation exclamation mark. You've got a depiction of St Mungo on the right, who is looking a bit comical, but also sinister, because he's got Second City, as in of Empire, swell written or shaved into the back of his head. He's holding an axe behind his hand with seed in the other, which he's holding out to the golden goose of Govan. And he's trying to get the revenue from Govan, which is kind of looking like the sun in the background. And there's other geese, which presumably are the other boroughs like Partick. And the caption is Mungo, dilly dilly, come and be killed, with three exclamation marks. So it's a little bit unhinged, but nevertheless, this was the point where annexation was formally going to happen in 1912. And there's a kind of slight air of petulance or melodrama in that cartoon. But we can maybe talk about that later. Again, that's just the kind of, from Glasgow City Archives, a kind of map showing how Glasgow's territory expanded in the 19th and 20th centuries, taking in these surrounding boroughs. And what we want to do now, before we go into a discussion, is just to highlight some of the 20th century changes and some of the 21st century challenges. So it's worth noting that by around 1900, Scotland still had an exceptionally complicated and diverse system of local government, as Alan McConnell, sorry, I forgot to put in the page reference there. That's bad form. Sorry about that. But basically, Scotland had a really complicated setup involving parish councils, community councils, and borough councils. By 1929, this had been changed. Interestingly, most of the big reforms after 1832 are by, or at least happen under the auspices of conservative UK governments. And one of those was 1929, when we moved to 21 large borough councils, 176 small borough councils, 3 county councils, and 196 district councils. After World War II, the amount of responsibility and power that local government had expanded because of the growth of the welfare state. And I mentioned the need to rebuild housing and so on. In the 1960s, Harold Wilson's Labour governments tried, if you think of white heat of technology and all that, an special focus on long-term planning and regional development, which Scottish local government seemed ill-equipped to deliver. In the late 1960s, under Labour, the Wheatley Commission was set up to report on what was wrong with the system and what could be done to reform it, although the actual implementation of the report happened under the Heath Conservative government. And I suppose the big takeaway from the Wheatley Commission was that, quote, something is seriously wrong with local government in Scotland. And that's a quote that's still often used in textbooks and articles about the system, because it still, unfortunately, often arguably remains the case. And it called again for a completely new structure. The upshot of this was that the boroughs were replaced by district councils in a new two-tier system, which regional councils were the top tier of. And the latter, the boroughs claimed to represent genuine communities. Again, how you define a community is very debatable. There's also a third but non-statutory tier of community councils. Those still exist. And they're maybe broadly equivalent to the old ward committees. Because although they have elected community councillors and sometimes co-opted ones, they're basically there to try and hold the council to account and to get it to be more rooted in local areas. In 1996, the then outgoing, only had a year left, Conservative UK government created 32 unitary local authorities for Scotland. These remain in place. A big part of that was to do with Strathclyde Regional Council, which you'll see in the next slide, but that, just flipping forward, that's its headquarters, much uglier, in my view at least, than the baronial town halls. But that was the sort of the 32 unitary authorities were created because Labour dominated Strathclyde Regional Council, which accounted for 40% of the Scottish population. And you could that although that had been created by the Conservatives, it was seen as an obstacle to Conservative policies and even democratic legitimacy. And so Ian Lang, as Scottish Secretary, and I think later on as well, Michael Forsyth, basically pushed through with fairly limited consultation this shift to the 32 unitaries. Um, in the 1990s and beyond, there was a backdrop of privatisation, outsourcing of council functions, competitive tendering, phrases like best value, and one academic, Rob Rhodes, called it the hollowing out of the state, and that played out at a local level as well. Um, so that's again just an image of Strathclyde Regional Council. Interestingly, in the 1980s and 90s, Scottish local government was a participant through COSLA in the Constitutional Convention for Scotland, which laid the groundwork for the modern day Scottish Parliament. And that Parliament actually briefly sat in that building that's on screen just now in the early 2000s, while the move to the new Parliament building in Edinburgh was being set up. Um, that's the kind of logo for Strathclyde region. If I can maybe share the slides with you later to look at in your own time, what seems to be, I can't find a date for this, unfortunately, but there seems to be a 1980s and 90s advert for the council, which is quite good. It's got kind of riffs off I Got You Babe of all things. And it's quite a nice advert, but it probably overpower our time. So I'll flip on just now. There's a map showing the present day unitary authorities, and again, there's some links in the slides which I can share with you later. But these basically highlight some of the details of how they're organised. Since the 1990s, there have been, and even since devolution, there's been rolling funding and legitimacy crisis for Scottish local government after devolution. For example, this week, council budgets and council tax increases have been controversial. It's worth noting that most local government funding in Scotland is done through the Scottish Parliament through block grants. Council tax is roughly, I think, 20% of the money that local government actually raises and spends. But especially in a cost of living crisis, it seems to be really resented. The system of council tax was brought in under the John Major government after Margaret Thatcher had basically committed political suicide by implementing the poll tax, or its more formal name was the community charge, and the idea was that was a per capita sort of a charge for services in local communities. Really controversial. Tried in Scotland first and protested here, protested in England as well. When it was protested in England, that actually basically brought Thatcher down, although there was stuff for Europe as well. Um, um, so local government funding actually in many ways is a sort of third rail in Scottish and UK politics. And I've said there half jokingly asked Thatcher because it brought her down, and Sturgeon because, although I should have said Salmond as well, but basically the SNP when they came in promised to reform local government taxation. There was actually a cross-party commission set up for it, which I think eventually recommended a local income tax. But for whatever reason, probably most likely to do with that third rail thing in electoral strategy, the government under Sturgeon backed off from it. Um, that was round about 2016, actually, not long before Brexit, that they actually disassociated from the recommendation. There's also been democratic deficits and disconnects even still. So in 2012, there was a report by the Jimmy Reid Foundation called The Silent Crisis, which basically, among other things, noted how even relative to England, Scots are really underrepresented at local government level. And although I don't have the stats to hand for Europe, there, in France, you can have something like, I think it's like 1,200 people to an elected representative at local level. And I think in the US at the lowest levels, you'll know more than me, but I think it's similar. So Scotland is a real outlier when it comes to genuinely democratic, connected, and democratic local government. Um, and a big question hanging over us as well is Scottish local government a partner with the central state in the delivery of national policy outcomes, or is it really a scapegoat for their failure? There's maybe something we can pick up in the discussion about what were called concordats between local government and the national government, where they basically, after the SNP came in 07, the council would promise not to raise council tax and they would get a bit more funding from the central block grant in return for delivering on priorities set by Holyrood. And getting towards the end here, don't worry, but just it's questionable whether the gathering of services under one roof through the unitary local government system set up in the 1990s that was promised has really been realised. There's also, as well as local government being fairly remote, there's the other problem that an awful lot of the functions of local government are carried out cooperatively between local government. So you get local health authorities, for example, that straddle council areas. You get low public awareness and understanding of local government powers and structures. Um, I've mentioned the report already. Police and Fire Reform Scotland Act 2012 basically created one single national police and fire force, which was a real different extreme from when in the 19th century each police borough had its own police force. So we've gone from one extreme to the other there. And again, there's this idea of the money really seems to drive things, and there's been an awful lot of real terms cuts over the last, feels like forever. The SNP government in 2015 legislated for what it called community empowerment, which arguably responsibilised communities to look after themselves as local government stepped back. This is arguably a return to pre-General Police Act voluntarism and middle class dominance. However, in fairness to the legislation, it does include standards, including a responsibility for inclusion and for councils to identify and address barriers to participation. Something similar to the Community Empowerment Act was mooted by Conservative Scottish Secretary Ian Lang back in the 1990s. So there's something interesting there about policy continuity between Labour, Conservative and SNP governments. And of course, Lib Dems were involved in coalition with Labour back in the noughties. Okay, so to conclude and to open up to discussion, Scottish local government has moved over the last 200 years from being hyper local to being remote and hyper centralised to the extent that it can be legitimate and has been legitimately questioned if it's local in any meaningful sense. Although Scottish local government was a key player in the 1989 to 95 cross party Constitutional Convention, and in that sense, a midwife of Scottish legislative devolution, the new Scottish Parliament, I say new, it's 25 years old now, it's been relegated to Cinderella status since. Nonetheless, pressure on devolved Scottish governments, whether of whatever party, to deliver national policy outcomes has resulted in local government being kept on a tight leash. And solving that, which of course is not necessarily our role as historians, will not be easy, but it will likely involve reviving some of the better traditions of local self-government from Scotland under the umbrella of quasi-federalised unitary authorities. Funding reform would be inextricably interlinked with that, and again, that might be why it won't happen, unfortunately. But what I suppose a big question I would ask you as well, and particularly from a US comparative perspective, would be what would or should genuine community empowerment look like? So I say I'm happy to share the slides later on because I've got a bibliography and things like that. But if I could throw open to a discussion, and that's the kind of interior of Govan Town Hall from 1899. So I thought I could be maybe a wee bit cheesy here, but say we could have a ward committee on the presentation. Thanks so much. I'm going to end the show now and hand over to Connie.
Well, wow, Professor Pugh, that was very interesting. I must say, I had no idea of the complexities of the development of government, local government in Scotland. And I would invite everyone to reactivate your cameras and unmute your microphones so that we can engage in an open discussion, question answer with Professor Pugh. But I'll start just to get it rolling, and then I'll try to help get everyone unmuted and the cameras back on. But the borough and other councils in Scotland nowadays appear to be building what's termed council housing, which, if I'm not mistaken, must be low rental cost housing. And this is a strange concept for me and for us Americans, I believe, where local government isn't typically involved in constructing low cost housing or welfare housing. And so, and I may be completely off the mark with this. This is a perception I've gained over there with a lot of eminent domain, confiscation of property, and rather homely buildings being constructed. And I'm wondering if you can give us your perspective on this and maybe explain this part of the council system to us, Michael, please.
Okay, I'll try. I know you've had Jim Smith on before, and I know he's
Oh,
written a lot
yes.
about
It's
this,
been a
so
while.
I'm
Yes.
I'm very much fumbling here, but my understanding is that you started so round about I think it was the 1920s, you started to get councils providing housing to some extent, although I don't think they had to do that. After the war, after World War II, they really did have to do that and they were required to. Going back a bit, of course, you remember that the 1918 general election was won by Lloyd George promising homes fit for heroes and things like that. And that sort of kind of carried the hope that more housing would be created and councils, did have a role to play that tied in with things like slum clearance as well, which was in many ways a hangover from the 19th century. But basically, so from the 1950s, you got competition between Labour and Conservative UK governments. At this time, they had this kind of it's called a post-war consensus. It didn't necessarily exist, but there was this kind of assumption that the two parties broadly agreed that there should be things like full employment, rights to housing, and things like that. And so you got competition between Labour and the Conservatives as to who could build more local authority homes, more public housing. So basically, Labour actually lost out in a sense to the Conservatives under Harold Macmillan, future Prime Minister, but then as Housing Minister, who actually overtook Labour in a number of council houses built. So this was obviously way before Thatcher, and Macmillan and Thatcher often clashed later on in the century. But it's interesting though that when Macmillan was able to beat that target, I think it was 3 million or something like that, but when he was able to beat the target because he used private finance, which Labour were not at that time willing to do. And then when you jump forward to the sort of 1980s, 90s, there was less council housing being built, I think in Scotland anyway. Certainly in my area, there was less being built. But when you get into the 2000s, there was recognised to be a bit of a problem with supply and maintenance of the houses. Part of the sort of background, I guess, of local government stepping back from things and contracting things out was that they did a thing called HST, so around about 2002, I think this happened, housing stock transfer, where they basically said, do you know what, run your council houses yourselves and they won't be council houses anymore, there'll be housing associations. And so a number of housing associations took over the running and the kind of upkeep and the renting out of what used to be council houses, and more were built and things like that. But I think the there was a thing as well, of course, how could I miss this out? In the 1980s, the kind of one of the flagship policies of the Thatcher government was the sale of council housing. So basically, if you own, if you not if you owned, if you rented a council house, council property, you could buy it off the local authority at a very low rate, a very low, a very low price, a very low mortgage. And the idea was that that would create a kind of property owning democracy. It was a kind of bridge between working class voters and the conservative governments, which is again, it ties in with party competition. Um, and I think as well, to be fair, the SNP under Alex Salmond introduced a ban on the further sale of council housing, so that because it was recognised that in the 1980s and 90s onwards, and part of the reason we had the housing stock transfer was to deal with what became residualisation, I think they call it, of council houses, where basically the ones that are not bought are the ones that are not very good and nobody wants to live in them. So it was sort of trying to deal with that, but I don't know if that answers your question, Connie.
Yeah, and I don't want to dominate. This is my last question, but the other perspective I've gained from living in Scotland is there seems to be a large and growing welfare state. And I don't know whether can you comment on that? Is that a misperception of mine? It's the indigenous Scots that seem to be more and more receiving pensions of all sorts, unemployment and otherwise. Can you comment on that at all?
I'll try. I mean, I have to say I haven't really prepared for that as such, as you know, but I
I'm
think
sorry,
no, 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 it's
just
okay.
in
No,
case.
I
Yes.
think but I have sort of taught social policy, so I'm a bit rusty on it, but I think there's sort of different perspectives on that. I know, for example, that there's been work done on one of the things the Thatcher government did, and there is that thing in Scotland that it's quite easy to kind of in modern parlance to hate on the Thatcher governments, but to look at it from a more wider academic perspective, there is increasing evidence, including archival evidence, that the some of the things the Thatcher government did in terms of deindustrialization policy were things that previous governments had considered doing, but were sort of shy of doing. So things like the Heath government, when it came in, had promised in the early 1970s that it would not bail out lame ducks in industry to promote competition and better productivity. But when it actually came to it, and companies like Rolls-Royce were hitting the skids, the Heath government U-turned and bailed them out. The Upper Clyde shipbuilders did a work in under Jimmy Reid, who I think mentioned in a different context. But that basically, again, in the face of partly electoral challenges, but also a slight moral qualm, the Heath government relented and basically nationalised. So it's a Conservative government, early 1970s, nationalised the shipyards on the Upper Clyde. Thatcher, when she came in, was determined not to U-turn, and in sort of internal discussions and documents suggest that she was warned that if you go ahead with deindustrialization on the scale that you're contemplating, people will get ill, people will die, people will not necessarily be able to retrain and things like that. And you will get high unemployment as well. And I think there was the highest in the early 1980s, there was the highest unemployment since the 1930s in not just the UK, but Scotland overall. And so the weird kind of, I don't know if it's ironic, but the weird thing that kind of made that possible was that the government knew that if it didn't provide and maintain benefits, then there could potentially be something approaching a revolution. So, or at least social upheaval, social strife. The way to prevent that was to kind of continue to pay high welfare payments. Ironically, though, that was only possible because North Sea oil had come, Scottish water, territorial waters, North Sea oil had come on stream in the 1970s, and it was that money effectively that allowed so it's this kind of paradox of the Thatcher governments, that a government that ostensibly is about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, not being bailed out, actually arguably could only survive by actually having a lot of people intergenerationally eventually on benefits. Although I can't comment on the current figures for how many people are on benefits. I know as well there's a lot of sort of in-work poverty in the UK and in Scotland, and things like food banks and community pantries are needed in areas even where people work. So there's yeah, it's complicated, I think.
Well, thank
Um,
you. Maybe we can take that offline at some point, Michael.
Um,
Sandy, do you have a question? And John Cameron, please.
uh, well, I would point out though, actually, Connie, that there's really comparable things happening in the U.S. with what's happening in Britain, and really, the diminution of the welfare state here, which we've seen in starting with Reagan, was very comparable to what was happening in Britain as a whole. And we did have local government housing here for many years. We still do. We still have local housing authorities in Chicago, Rockford, Peoria, and many other municipalities around the country. So what we've seen here is a comparable, really called neoliberalism in terms of the overall policy idea of privatizing services and taking away from government. And sort of the New Deal programs that we had here were much comparable to what the Labour government had done in Britain as a whole. So now we're seeing the consequences of this, among which is a huge housing crisis in the United States, and we still don't know how to respond to it. And obviously, under the current administration, it seems unlikely that the government will play any real role in doing that.
I think the thing that surprised me, John, I guess the main point, the main emphasis is that it's the indigenous Scots that seem to be comprising the majority of the welfare in Scotland. There's been tremendous immigration from other countries in recent years, and it seems to be the indigenous Scots themselves who are in large numbers depending on the welfare. I just was surprised by that.
Well,
Not
that's
the
true.
immigrants.
It's true in the United States as well. The vast majority of people on, public aid or Medicaid or SSA, Medicare, are rural, what we would call typical indigenous Americans, white Americans, as opposed to immigrants. So it's very similar to that.
I didn't realize that. Thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think as well there's a thing, Connie, I think it's called the Glasgow effect that and there's been more research done into this recently. People like Chick Collins, who used to work at UWS actually, have looked at why health outcomes for Glasgow and mortality, and I'm not really doing this justice, but it seems to be much higher than it quote unquote should be relative to other deindustrialized areas. And so there's been a lot of kind of including by I think Chick now runs the Glasgow Public Health Observatory, but things like that, really looking at why is it so bad in Glasgow and what is that? Part of the answer to that seems to be some of the points I was making about the government policy, but it wasn't just about, to be fair, it wasn't just about what the Thatcher government was doing. It were also decisions made by local authorities themselves about actually to do with basically moving people out of the inner city and into the outlying areas, the sort of high rises and all that kind of stuff as well. Low quality, mass public housing. So yeah, it's an interesting one. I don't know, there's no easy answers, but I know that there's a lot of research ongoing into that sort of thing. So it's a fair question, Connie. Absolutely. I just don't happen to have a definitive answer. And it's interesting as well that what John was saying about the parallels with the US and sort of neoliberalism there. I think there's absolutely it's yeah it's a really difficult one, and people's real lives are affected. Yeah.
Is the Scottish government and the local governments operating with a deficit of funding? I mean, are they running a huge deficit like we are here in the United States?
I That's a really good question. I don't think it's quite in the sense that I think that there is a requirement on the local authorities to balance their budgets every year, which means, and this is partly why they raise council tax, and kind of cut services, but there is this sort of it's kind of tricky because the Scottish government really sets the priorities that the councils have to implement. There's a kind of statutory thing where there's a I can't remember the exact, I think it's mandated powers and discretionary powers that the councils have. Discretionary powers would be providing things like local parks and leisure centres, whereas mandatory things are much more about health, policing, roads, things like that. And what you quite often find is that as the funding envelope from the centre is reduced, as happened in the last Scottish budget, and I think was it November, the councils then in turn have to make cuts, and that's really, really unpopular locally. One of the sort of things that happens is that in the run up to the budget, the councillors will send a kind of almost like a hit list of these are the things we might need to get rid of, including things like school crossing patrols and things like that. And the way they kind of do it, it's like we will therefore have to increase your council tax because if we don't, you will lose these things. And occasionally as well, there's a kind of attempt at almost participatory budgeting, but it's a bit cynical in the sense that, for example, in my area a few years ago, we were given a choice between a shorter school day in the local authority schools or not having the parks maintained, the grass cut and things like that, which obviously both of those things are desirable, but they're of different levels of priority. But by giving us a quote unquote choice, there was a sort of, it was almost like they were kind of dipping the public's hands in the blood of the sort of bad choices they were going to have to make. Anyway, one thing that's to go to your question about the deficit, I've always wondered why council leaders don't just stand up and say, no, we're not going to do this. Yes, it's our legal requirement, but the real responsibility lies with Holyrood, and but they never seem to quite do that. And I don't know if is it because they share party interests, or is it that they worry about, I suppose if they didn't balance their budget, I don't know, but I'm imagining it might be something similar to, like a federal government shutdown in the US. Would things happen if it shut down? I don't know the answer to that, but I think there's artificially they just stay out of
No,
deficit.
the head of Scottish government in Washington, D.C., who spoke at the forum a couple of years ago, had some statistics and said that Scotland is one of the only countries in the world that has no rights to borrow money from financial institutions or banks. England can borrow money, but Scotland can't borrow money. I've never heard of any country not having the ability to borrow. Do you happen to know anything about that?
Oh, pardon me. Can I interrupt for a second?
Of course.
You have to distinguish between what the rights and responsibilities are with the UK and the rights and responsibilities of Scotland. Scotland, as our speaker said, is not an independent country. It is a country, but it is governed by the UK government, which does have the right and responsibility. And Scotland is given a grant, a very generous grant, every year from the British government to make up for some deficits. And in fact, the amount of money that is given per capita to Scotland is greater than the amount of money that is given per capita but from the UK government by England. And the other thing, Speaker, I really appreciate your talk. I grew up in Scotland and my sister still lives there. So I keep up. I get the Herald every day. I'll stop because it goes beyond the question. Well, one of the things is that for since the SNP has been in power in Edinburgh, they have frozen council budgets, council taxes, which squeezes the local councils, and it means that the government in Edinburgh can give out stuff like candy, if you will, which helps them buy votes, if you will, but the local councils are squeezed and cannot do the things that they are legally supposed to do. So you said the word cynical before, and I think all politics is cynical, but in Scotland it certainly is.
Thanks, Helen. I mean, I think you've covered most of what I was going to say there. I was just thinking, though, I was sort of reflecting that it is something that the paradox is maybe putting it a bit strongly, but when you consider that the SNP was founded from within local government back in the 1930s because of resentment of conservative reforms in the 1920s of local government and interfering with structures and so on, there is certainly an irony that the present day Scottish government, and you can see why they're tempted to operate in this way, but they've had these things that they I think we mentioned them in the slides, but the concordats, where they freeze effectively what goes to local government, but they also encourage local government not, well, and if you sign the concordat, you can't raise your local council tax, and it sort of creates this weird thing where there were hopes before the Scottish Parliament was founded that it would have local government as a kind of possibly an equal, kind of almost like a second chamber to it, not literally. If you go back to the 1960s when the Heath opposition, Conservative Party then made the Declaration of Perth, they were looking at having an indirectly elected Scottish, not Parliament, but Assembly, which would be representatives of the boroughs, or, well, of local government that would be there. So it's really interesting that the SNP, despite their origins, and their original raison d'etre, are quite very controlling, if you like, of local government. Part of that, again, is about the gradualist strategy towards independence, needing to be seen to be competent in delivering services and things like that. Although whether or not that's worked out is a whole other question, I suppose. But yeah, it's again not a party political point, but it's just interesting that there's been that kind of trajectory, if that makes sense. Sorry, I've killed the mood here.
No, I think I probably helped in that, Michael.
No, Helen, your comments were very much appreciated. I know very little about government, and now I find that I have a need to learn more.
It's really quite interesting. There was an article, Michael, you may have seen it in the Herald about 2 or 3 weeks ago, about the basic. All government is about making choices and making choices about what to invest in for the obviously the advantage of the people that are there. And the Scottish government has made some interesting investments. So you have free bus fare for under 22s and over 60, I think it is, or 55 or 60. Now, this costs the Scottish government about £250 million. So it's not free. So you have baby boxes, you have all sorts of stuff that are very popular things. But in the meantime, if you will, they haven't necessarily focused on the day job. So education, healthcare, and infrastructure have suffered quite seriously in Scotland over the last 15 to 20 years. So it's and again, the councils have been squeezed. So it's interesting.
And Helen, aren't the councils now beginning to pass increases in their local rates? I saw Orkney just raised theirs by 15%, and it seemed a number of the other local councils.
Absolutely. Well, they have to, because they have to provide services.
Sure.
They're the closest to the people, but they're really caught. The local councils are really caught in the middle. It's very difficult.
excuse me, who pays for the secondary education, the free university education? Where does that funding come
Well,
from?
that comes from the Scottish government through the Higher Education Council in Scotland, and the universities are being squeezed as well. And interestingly enough, because of you say Scottish university education is free, it's not free, somebody pays, it's the Scottish government. But what happened is that because the universities are also being squeezed, they are more and more getting people from generally the United States to come over and get a Scottish education, paying the full board, much cheaper than here, by the way, in the United States. But as a result, there are actually fewer Scottish students that are able to get places in Scottish universities.
Yeah.
So, you know, unintended consequences of things that that seem to be popular. I mean, it's a dilemma of government everywhere.
That actually has happened in the United States, where the overseas students who pay very high tuition have been favored at the universities for admission, and so the United States citizens are having a harder time competing to get in. Yeah,
right.
That's definitely the case in the University of Illinois, where they were having a major discussion over that sort of thing. And even the private universities are faced with an unusual one now, because the Trump administration wants to start taxing their endowments heavily. And my employer, Northwestern, is very worried, because if they throw a 10% tax on the endowment, that's going to take away from all the monies that they are using for funding research and then student support.
Yeah.
So they're very scared right now.
Yeah. Yeah. I apologize. I seem to have aided in having this deteriorate.
No, this is very
political discussion.
This is so critical, I think, Helen. You know, the other thing that's happened in Scotland, they're increasing the taxes on tourism there's a hotel tax now, and tourism is probably the largest industry, if you will, in Scotland right now. So it's just wondering.
We're actually dealing with those increased costs this summer, because the McFarlane Society annual general meeting is going to be over in Scotland, and it's our every 3-year trip, and things are going up right and left, so we're having trouble setting the final cost for everybody.
We have the same issues here in the state of Illinois, and actually, the local government in Illinois and Scotland is more comparable to the state government here in Illinois than it is to, say, the U.S. government. And we have all the same kind of constraints with our fiscal issues.
Right.
Actually, one of the problems that we have in Illinois is that we have so many sub-governmental units that they're crisscrossing, and your taxes are on your properties, especially, are not that any one body taxes you the most. It's the death by 1,000 cuts theory.
Wow. It's also because it's much, you can't raise, there's limits on the electoral ability to raise property taxes. So what you do is you create a new taxing institution. So that's why you have this plethora of taxing bodies. And it's the opposite of what's happened in Britain with consolidation and centralization.
It actually reminds me of something I forgot to say earlier, which is that the council tax in Scotland, and indeed throughout the UK, it's set, the property bands at which it's levied are set at 1991 property values, because that's when the major government brought them in. And it means that it's effectively a regressive tax yet again.
Right.
The classic example would be that the king for Balmoral would pay the same as I think it's a Band E property in, the outskirts of Glasgow or something like that. It's just, it's kind of wild. I mean, of course, Balmoral's tax arrangements are a whole other thing anyway, so I probably shouldn't have used that as an example, but it's wild, there's, and again, it's because there's quite a reticence to touch this, because bad things have happened to politicians.
Right. Whereas I'm in Massachusetts, and we assess the value of houses on a very regular basis. And then, of course, you get increases in taxes. I keep saying to my sister who lives in Ayrshire that she's very lucky that they haven't reassessed the value.
Yeah.
Helen, where do you live in? Do you live in Massachusetts?
I live in Concord, Massachusetts.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Very historic.
Thank you so much for joining.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thanks.
Thank you for holding these. They're very interesting.
Oh, I find that the caliber of our speakers is just tremendous.
Yes, it's terrific.
And this has been
So
very
much for having
different,
me.
Michael, but very fascinating.
Thanks.
Any more discussion or question answer for Professor Pugh?
Yeah, I'd just like to know if we could donate Elon Musk to Scotland and get him the heck out.
No, please, no. Weirdly, I was
Well-
just asked today to sign up. That you get these email things asking you to sign petitions against them.
Ah.
It said Elon
Sorry.
Musk in Western Bartonshire, which is where I live, and I thought, I hope he's not. But yeah,
But
As not to have a political discussion, perhaps we should conclude the forum for today. But I just can't thank all of you enough for dialing in every month and participating and keeping Scottish culture alive in America and globally. And you all just do us proud. And we're just so fortunate to have the exposure to all of you. You're highly intelligent, sophisticated people, and it's a pleasure to talk with you every month. Michael, thank you. I will be in touch with you. Can't thank you enough. Would probably
Thanks,
like to
Grace.
have another presentation on a similar
much.
line. So, but I think we'll go ahead. We'll adjourn the meeting for today. We'll see you next month. And please, everybody, be safe until then. Thank you.
Thanks all. Take
Thanks,
care.
everybody.
Pleasure. Thank you. Bye.
Yeah, well, that's what they're called.